Hi, everyone, and welcome to day 2 of Compliance and Ethics Week. Thank you. And for those who didn't join us yesterday, welcome to today's session, which is updating documentation, what makes a compliant addendum. We are recording this session, and all recordings from the entire week will be made available to all those that participate. We will be taking time at the end for questions. So if you have questions, please pop them in the chat and we'll get to them at the end. But I want to go ahead and get to the presentation. So I will introduce our speaker today, who is Michelle Wolstein. She joined OMP Insight as a consultant specializing in Medicare compliance for orthotics and prosthetics. Her Medicare experience began in 2006 with Noridian Healthcare Solutions, working under both Part B physicians and the DME MAC contracts. She served as one of the DME team's OMP specialists, working closely with OMP suppliers and medical review nurses to understand the intricate balance between Medicare compliance while operating an OMP business in today's world. She understands that OMP suppliers have a unique set of challenges they face compared to traditional DME suppliers, and she finds great joy in helping businesses overcome these challenges to be successful. So with that, I'll turn it over to Michelle.
Thank you so much. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us for day 2 of Compliance and Ethics Week. As Joy indicated, we are going to be talking today about updating documentation, specifically what makes addendums compliant. We'll talk about the difference between addendums, amendments, and letters of medical necessity. And we'll also talk about signature requirements. Those are some of the top questions that I receive in the field in regards to what is and is not compliant, reviewing of signatures or records to determine whether it's compliant. And so hopefully when you leave here today, you'll have a little bit better understanding of some of the metrics that you can use in order to determine what is and is not compliant when it comes to those amendments and addendums and the signatures themselves. So we'll start off by talking about the different types of changes or addendums to the medical records, how they all differ, and how you can differentiate between the two. A lot of times, especially with addendum and amendment, we use those terms interchangeably, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. There is a distinct difference. But ultimately, the whole purpose of whether it's an addendum or amendment or a letter of medical necessity is, our purpose typically is for compliance, but it's really to add any missing or incorrect details, clarifications of incorrect details, things of that to provide clarity in the record to help substantiate and justify the need for the device in question. We'll go through some tips on how to determine whether or not the addendum or the amendment that you're looking at is in fact valid. Again, some of those metrics that you can use to kind of differentiate the two. And we'll go through compliant signatures, and that'll include both wet or handwritten signatures, as well as electronic or digitally captured signatures and authentication. We'll talk both about the language requirements as well as best practices and how those can kind of differ and what we recommend in the industry for incorporating into your internal compliance protocol or for valid signatures and things of that nature. So first off, let's talk a little bit about these different types of records, the addendums, the amendments, and the letter of medical necessity, and kind of differentiate between the three of them. First of all, the addendum, to add, exactly as the name implies, you are adding information to the medical record that either is completely missing, maybe left out information specific to a particular coverage criteria outlined in that policy, or it was inadvertently left out, maybe just an oversight by the treating practitioner, and they just need a reminder about what those criteria are. And based on your own evaluation, it may have been determined that, the patient is in fact ambulatory, but the medical record shows that the patient was in a wheelchair. And there needs to be clarification added to say, yes, they were in a wheelchair for their visit, but they are capable of ambulating. Those types of things can be incorporated into the addendum to add that clarifying information in order to help substantiate the medical necessity. Now, You'll find this to be true with everything we talk about here today, is that these addendums should take place as close to the original office visit date as possible. The closer they are to that original office visit date, the more weight they carry in a formal claim review. And this is really for recollection purposes. I don't know about you, but I have a hard time remembering what I ate for lunch last week, let alone expecting a practitioner to remember what transpired in an office visit with a patient that happened months ago or weeks ago, especially when they see 20 patients a day. So the closer it happens to the original office visit, the better it is. There's no set time frame within which Medicare or a payer will establish that an addendum is valid. But like I said, the closer, the better. I recommend getting them prior to claim delivery prior to delivery of the device or prior to claim submission at the latest. If they need to happen after that point, it's not that it wouldn't be appropriate. Again, it's just going to hold less weight. Now, amendments, on the other hand, again, the name itself kind of implies what its purpose is to amend, to change or correct information that's in that medical record. Maybe something was misstated. We see a lot of instances in the medical record where maybe there's a review of systems and it'll indicate under the musculoskeletal section that there's no instability. But then later in the record, the physician does mention instability. So there you've got a conflict of information. And so the amendment might be necessary to correct that discrepancy in the record or to clarify that discrepancy in the record. And again, just like with the addendum, amendment should take place as close to the original office visit as possible so that they carry the most weight in a claim review. We've seen a number of instances, especially at the ALJ level recently for Medicare, where amendments and addendums that take place months after the original office visit are not considered valid or don't carry enough substantial information to help overturn the outcome of that claim. Next, we have the letter of medical necessity. I see this commonly get confused with the addendum and the amendment. And what makes these a little bit more unique is that they're typically a standalone record. They might be considered part of the patient's overall medical record, but they're not necessarily part of the original office visit note. And so it's considered a separate document. A lot of times you'll see it formatted in a letter format. It may even say something like to whom it may concern. This document carries far less weight than either the addendums or the amendments in my experience. It's not to say they don't carry any weight at all. I have seen circumstances where a letter of medical necessity has changed the outcome of a claim review in the favor of the supplier. But it's one of those situations where I would use the letter of medical necessity as a last resort. If you weren't able to get a valid addendum or an amendment earlier in the process, I would use the letter of medical necessity as a last resort. Just like with the addendum and the amendment, it should be written as close to the original office date as possible, and it must be signed and dated in order to be considered valid. A lot of times I don't typically see that as an issue much with addendums and amendments. The software that they're using typically automatically captures that. But I see lots of instances where a letter of medical necessity is written with, and it either doesn't include a signature and a date, or it only includes one or the other. So make sure that it's properly authenticated in order for it to be considered valid. So with that being said, let's talk about what exactly makes those addendums and amendments valid, because there's a lot of things to take into consideration. In those instances where they're being added to the original record, you want to make sure the original content is still clearly legible. This is more so applicable to your handwritten medical record. We don't see those quite as often anymore, but still applicable. So make sure that whatever's being added or changed, that the original content of the record is still very legible and is still captured to reflect what was noted in the original office visit. Then any of the new or changed information should be clearly identified. You should be able to look at that record and be able to instinctively know what information was added after the fact, what the addendum or the amendment was compared to the original content. And in addition to that, like I said, the EMR software that they're using, or if they're handwritten, it should clearly reflect what information is being added and capture who added it and when. Again, that's more going to be applicable to your EMR softwares. Any reviewer wants to know who added that information and when it was added so they can see that in relation to the original office visit note. It should also clearly identify it as an addendum or added information or amendment to that record. Again, that's going to help differentiate it from the original content. And it should reference the original office visit date. A lot of times I will see documents that are identified as an addendum or an amendment, but it's a standalone note by itself with no reference to an original office visit date. It'll have the patient information, it'll have the date this information was added to the overall medical record, but there's no correlation between that note and the original office visit date. I would consider that a letter of medical necessity, not an addendum or an amendment. So make sure if that standalone note is intended to be an addendum or an amendment, that it clearly calls back to the original office visit note, or it references, say, addendum to office visit and then month, date, year, so that it's indicative of the fact that it is in fact added information to that original office visit record. So now let's move on and talk a little bit about compliance signatures. This is another area where I receive a lot of questions or a lot of requests to review a signature to provide feedback on whether or not it's compliant. So first, we'll begin with your wet signatures, your handwritten signatures. We see this a lot on prescriptions and SWOs, or like I mentioned before, if the practitioner you're dealing with still charts their notes in a handwritten format, their document will be wet as well, or their signature will be wet. So like I said, it's a handwritten signature. It should include a printed name if the signature is not legible. And let's be honest, most signatures these days, mine included, is not clearly legible. So if it's not a legible document, or I'm sorry, if it's not a legible signature, there should be a printed name as well. You could also use a signature log or a signature attestation. We'll talk more about signature logs on the next slide. Signatures must be dated. I cannot stress this enough. Under Medicare protocol, signatures are not considered valid if they are not dated, and that applies across the board to any and all types of documents. I should take that back. Let me correct myself in saying that the SWO no longer requires a signature date, but medical records, addendums, letters of medical necessity, those all need to have both a signature and a signature date, because it needs to be reflective of when that signature was affixed to that document. Now, depending on the practitioner, they might not be conditioned to sign a document including their credentials. That's fine if they don't, but make sure that if requested, you have access to proof of that practitioner's credentials. Whether it's just pulling up their MPI record that reflects what their credentials are, or a document that the practitioner can provide for you that is proof of their credentials, whatever that might look like. It could even be included in their printed name with their credentials. That's fine. A lot of practitioners include that if they have, even if they're handwritten notes, maybe they're using a document with letterhead, and the letterhead has their credentials, that would be fine too. Just make sure that if their signature doesn't automatically include credentials, that you have an alternative way of proving what that practitioner's credentials are. That's not always going to be critical, but if it's ever called into question, you want to make sure you have access to documentation that you can substantiate the practitioner's credentials. And this is also true for your own clinician records. These signature requirements apply to your clinical records as well. So your orthotists, your prosthetists, pedorthists, they should all be following these same signature requirements, these same amendment and addendum requirements that we're going through. Although I'm referencing medical records, and I'm talking a lot about treating practitioners, these requirements also all apply to your clinicians as well. So coming back to that signature log, this is going to be primarily for those practitioners who are handwriting their signature and whose signature maybe isn't always legible, and the records that they're providing do not necessarily include their printed name as well. You can maintain a log of your own creation in your files for your referral sources. That includes the treating practitioner name, their credentials, and I also recommend at the very least it include both a sample of their handwritten initials and their handwritten full signature. And that will that can be used in any sort of a formal claim review with any signed documents that you might have whose signature is not legible. You can add that signature log to that claim review to substantiate the signature on those documents. Next up, we have our electronic signatures. So many of our practitioners these days, including our own clinicians, have adopted various types of EMR software programs, which for legibility purposes, I absolutely love. It makes my job in particular so much easier. But it comes with its own set of challenges, especially when it comes to capturing a valid signature from that practitioner. So these signatures, when they are electronic, they should include the name, the date that the electronic signature was captured, and the credentials. It doesn't necessarily have to include a digitally affixed, what looks like a digitally affixed handwritten signature. I'm guessing you know what I'm talking about. It can just simply say something like electronically signed by Joe Smith, MD on March 15th of 2023. It doesn't have to necessarily look like a handwritten signature. It can just be captured in that way. But it does have to be identified as electronic. I've listed just a handful of examples of what that might look like, but this is not an all-inclusive list. But it cannot just simply say signed by. It needs to be electronically signed by, digitally captured by, authorized by, authenticated by, something to that effect to reflect that the signature is captured electronically in some capacity and whose signature is being captured. Electronic medical records must be electronically signed and dated. This is what I would consider a best practice. The Medicare policy doesn't specify that wet or handwritten medical records have to be a handwritten signature and handwritten date, and electronic medical records have to be electronically signed and electronically dated. This is a best practice though. I've heard medical records state this, although medical policy does not state it. And so this is a very strong best practice recommendation that if you have handwritten documents, they be hand signed or have wet signature and a wet signature date. If you have EMR records, they should be electronically signed and electronically dated. I do not recommend handwritten signatures on electronic medical records. Now, the other thing to keep in mind about electronic medical records, I've actually seen a lot of instances lately where maybe you have access to that referral source's medical records, but the examples that you've seen or the records that you see are not a finalized record. Maybe they're the patient view of that record, and it doesn't usually include an electronic signature. That record for formal claim review purposes is not valid. It must be signed. I cannot stress that enough. So make sure that you have access to get signed medical records in the event of a formal claim review. I've also heard excuses from referral sources that say that their software does not capture an electronic signature. feel free to report back to that referral source if they tell you something like that, that if their medical records cannot be electronically signed, then they are not a legal document. And they should be going back to their software program and getting instructions on how to obtain or how to capture those signatures in their EMR software, or they should be maybe looking into a new EMR software if they can't capture signatures, because it's a legal document and it needs to be signed in order to be considered valid. Now, if they have software that captures the electronic signature in kind of a unique way that doesn't reflect the information that I've suggested here today, one thing that can be done, and actually I think I'm jumping ahead, we'll talk about software authentication protocol for EMR records here in just a minute. So hold tight. First, let's talk about the Dear Physician letter. This is a letter that's been made available to physicians or to clinicians and suppliers to send out to their referral sources if the documents that they are providing are not properly authenticated. This is primarily for electronic medical records. So if you have a referral source who's pushing back and who's not providing you with a compliant record that's properly authenticated, you can send them this letter that has been written by the medical directors from all 4 jurisdictions for Medicare. And it will provide them with feedback and education on what is considered a valid electronic signature. You can see it captures a lot of the same information that we talked about today. Clearly and permanently identify any amendments, clearly indicate the date and the author of the amendment, and identify the original content without deletion. So this is just a sample of what that letter looks like. You can get a copy of that from both the Noridian and the CGS websites if you think you would benefit from having this letter on hand to send to your referral sources if you're getting non-compliant medical record signatures. So let's jump back to that EMR authentication protocol. Like I mentioned before, if you have instances where the treating practitioner is providing you with medical records that aren't properly authenticated and they're telling you that your software can't or doesn't capture signatures in the way in which you're requesting, you can ask them to send you a copy of their EMR authentication protocol. They should know what that is, or their EMR software company definitely will know what that is. Sometimes you can even Google the EMR software that this practitioner uses and find this information online. And basically what you're looking for is, and the protocol should outline the process by which they authenticate or capture signatures in their software. It could be a matter of, the author has to enter in a PIN or a password in order for it to digitally affix a signature to the document. Whatever that process is or that protocol is, they should have that documented in some kind of a user manual of some sort for their software. So this is something I recommend getting if they're trying to tell you that the EMR software does not capture the signature with the information that we've recommended it contain, so that you can prove that the signature that is presented on the medical records that you have is in fact valid and it meets Medicare signature authentication protocol. And so again, this is one of those last resort type things. If the treating practitioner is not working with you or they're giving you excuses about the software that they use, seek out their authentication protocol. And if the protocol that's outlined aligns with what you're being told by the practitioner and accurately reflects the information that's on the medical record, you can use this in the event of a formal claim review. But there still has to be some information on that record to clearly identify that it has been properly authenticated in order to be considered valid. So with that, we've got a few minutes left. We covered a lot of information in about 20-25 minutes. I'm betting
you do have some questions. Yes. So I will go ahead and throw them to you. So first question, to confirm, a signature log is not required if the physician's name is printed by the signature.
That is correct. If the document itself clearly reflects a legible signature or a properly authenticated EMR record, you don't need a signature log. It can be a best practice to get it for some of your most common referral sources, so you have it in the event of a review and you don't have to ask for it every time. But if the document clearly reflects a handwritten signature and a printed name, even if they're not hand printing it, if the name is printed elsewhere in the document, that is perfectly sufficient. You don't necessarily have to get that signature log every single time. And you can just have a standing signature log with those signature examples for that practitioner that you just maintain on file, just to confirm the validity of that signature.
Next question. Can another physician other than the MD that did the initial note in the same office sign the addendum or amendment?
Yes, absolutely. We see that quite often. As long as they're within the same practice or medical group, it's perfectly appropriate. It doesn't necessarily have to be under certain circumstances, but we do see a lot of the, if they're out on a medical leave themselves or out on an extended vacation, or even in situations where maybe they just very recently left the practice. It's the Medicare's assumption that it's reasonable to expect that practitioners in the same practice have equal access to that patient's records. And so they can sign, they can add addendums, if particularly ideally if they were in some way part of that office visit. They can also sign off on SWOs on the other practitioner's behalf if they're out of the office when the SWO is sent over. So yeah, if they're part of the same medical group, that's perfectly appropriate.
Okay, great. Does an LMN have to be electronically signed?
It can be a handwritten one. It can be a wet signature as well. It doesn't always have to be electronic, but there does have to be a signature on an LMN, whether it's electronic or handwritten. It has to be signed to be considered valid.
Okay. And the next question is, what is your opinion on stamped signatures for commercial payers?
Stamped signatures are never acceptable. No exception. Well, I shouldn't say that. There are very, very limited exceptions for people who have been granted access or granted permission to do so. Maybe they have some sort of a physical handicap that limits their ability to appropriately sign a document. But nowadays with EMR records, I don't see a huge need for that. So the general rule of thumb is that stamped signatures and stamped dates are not appropriate. Electronically captured signature dates are fine, but a stamped date, stamped signature, not appropriate.
Okay. And this is along a question along the same lines as dates. For signature date, does the date need to be adjacent to the signature as opposed to somewhere else in the document, such as the visit date at the beginning?
So a visit date is different from a signature date. However, the signature date doesn't necessarily have to be in the same vicinity of the signature itself. I've seen instances where maybe the signature is captured in the bottom part of the medical record, but the top header says that it was signed and it reflects the date. And so they don't have to be in close proximity to one another, but there is definitely a clear difference between a signature date and an office visit date.
Right, we'll give people a few more seconds to put in any more questions they might have for Michelle.
Oh, one of the things I wanted to touch on while we're waiting to see if we have any other questions. This is something that I've seen come up just recently, where an addendum was requested by the treating practitioner, and they added it as a separate office visit note in the form of a telemedicine visit. So they had called the patient or the patient had called them and they charted that note in a separate document, but it referred back to the original office visit. The problem with this particular type of addendum or amendment was that it clearly reflected that a nurse, an RN, took that call and charted that note and signed off on it. It did reference a treating practitioner MD, but it was very clear that that addendum was done by an RN. And that would be a supporting document, but it couldn't stand alone to support the medical necessity. And that's what the purpose of the addendum was. And so in that situation, I did not accept it for compliance purposes because it was clear it was done by an RN. And it was necessary to support medical necessity. And that really needs to be captured by the treating practitioner in the form of that addendum. If it was clear that the treating practitioner had made that phone call and had that conversation and charted that note, it would be different. And I've seen where maybe a medical assistant or a nurse is transcribing and charting part of the medical record, but the physician carries out the rest of the visit and signs off on the document, and that's perfectly fine and acceptable. Just make sure that it is clear who is acting as the provider versus who is just transcribing or notating that information in the record.
Right, we just got one more question in. I'll take this last question. So to confirm for an SWO, another doctor, NP, et cetera, can sign the SWO for the doctor if they are not in the office.
Yes, as long as they are part of the same medical practice or the same medical clinic. The exception to that, and it's not really an exception, under Medicare for those devices that require a face-to-face and written order prior to delivery or are under prior authorization, it must be the other practitioner. You can have different treating practitioner versus prescribing practitioner, but it must be clear that the prescribing practitioner that signs the SWO has received a copy of the face-to-face office visit evaluation and reviewed that before they sign off on the SWO. So again, yes, it's perfectly acceptable, but depending on the device, you want to make sure that that prescribing practitioner has received a copy of the face-to-face before they signed off on the SWO or the written order prior to delivery as appropriate.
Okay, we're getting a couple more questions. We'll take a few more. So the next question then, bill whoever signs the SWO, correct?
Correct. Whoever signs the SWO, they are listed as the referring provider on the claim.
Okay. And then does the name have to be updated on the SWO for the person who signed, or can we leave the current doctor?
If it really depends on how the signature is captured. If it's a handwritten signature, they should be printing their name as well. If it's an electronically captured signature, typically that will capture that also. You don't necessarily have to go back and correct the treating practitioner name listed on the SWO, as long as the signature is either legible or it includes a printed name. That should be satisfactory.
Okay. All right, well, thank you, Michelle, and thank you for everybody for joining us. We hope you will join us for the next 3 days. And like I said at the beginning, this will get the slides and the recording out to all who attended. So you'll have this to refer back to.
Thank you very much. Have a great day.
Bye.